She came to the men's shooting range without loud words, in simple clothes and with someone else's weapon. Everyone, from the competitors to the spectators, laughed. No one knew who she was. But after her first shot, the hall fell silent, and a few minutes later, the career of the champion ended. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what city you're from. It really matters to us. The Red Line Range was not merely a shooting club, it was a temple of masculine dominance tucked into the arid folds of a sprawling Texas ranch. Its walls were a shrine to glory and violence, lined with photos of grinning men in tactical gear and faded medals hanging like dead weight. Every inch of the facility exuded money, legacy, and the quiet sneer of exclusion. Entry required sponsorship or invitation, and only those deemed worthy, men of proven aim, hardened by war or boardroom conquests, were allowed behind its reinforced glass doors. On the morning of the Titan Invitational, the club buzzed with a quiet electricity. Outside, a line of gleaming black SUVs and desert-toned pickup trucks glittered in the harsh sunlight, each vehicle a testament to the wealth and power of its owner. Inside, men in Oakley sunglasses and stitched-down combat pants gathered in tight clusters. They boasted stories of operations overseas, traded tales of hunts and hostage rescues, their laughter barking across the halls like gunfire. Most of them had long ago traded their uniforms for tailored suits or private contractor gear, but their presence remained just as commanding. They were veterans, mercenaries, corporate bodyguards, sons of senators, and CEOs who fancied themselves warriors. Each had come to this gathering for one reason: dominance. Not just over the target, but over every man in the room. At the center of the main range stood the reigning champion, Arnell Baker, a man whose presence was as unmistakable as a rifle report in an empty canyon. His arms bulged beneath his dry-fit shooting shirt, his tattoos inked like battle scars, coiled with purpose. Arnell was the club's golden son, winner of the last 6 invitationals and the undisputed alpha. His name was etched into plaques, his picture hung above the entrance, his signature rifle mounted in a glass case by the check-in desk. He was laughing now, surrounded by a small entourage. Men clapped him on the back, toasted with energy drinks laced with caffeine and ego. The tournament hadn't even begun, but everyone knew how it would end. Then the doors opened and everything shifted by a single, imperceptible degree. She stepped inside quietly, unnoticed at first. Her boots were dusty, her jeans were faded. A long olive-green field jacket covered her frame. There was no flash of wealth in her appearance, no gear bag emblazoned with elite brands. She carried a steel case and a small brown envelope in one hand. Her hair was braided tightly against her head, her expression unreadable. When the receptionist looked up, her practiced smile faltered. Eyes flicked across the room as silence pressed like a low hum. Someone laughed nervously, unsure if the woman had taken a wrong turn from the highway. "Ma'am," the receptionist began, voice tilting with disbelief. "This is a private—" The woman held up the envelope. "Camilla Hope, I have an invitation." The name struck like a hammer on cold steel. Somewhere near the back of the room, an older man in a security vest straightened. He stepped forward, slowly, peering at the envelope, then at her face. A flicker of recognition dawned. "You're General Hope's daughter." The name silenced the whispers. General Elijah Hope, decorated war hero, former commandant of the 2nd Recon Sniper Regiment, and once a co-founder of this very range. A man who, after speaking out in favor of integrating the tournament with qualified female veterans, had been pushed out in disgrace. Camilla nodded once, her expression impassive. The envelope bore his signature, sealed 3 years prior and held back until now. It granted his named guest the right to compete in the Invitational. It had been a symbolic gesture, a rebellion forged in ink against the walls that once worshipped him. The receptionist hesitated, then tapped into the registry system. Her fingers froze over the keyboard. The name was there, signed, authorized, locked. A murmur spread across the room. Arnell's chuckle broke the tension. So, they're letting kitchen staff on the range now? Laughter erupted, loud and forced, but not everyone laughed. Some stared at Camilla with unease, unsure whether this was a joke, a stunt, or something else entirely. She said nothing. "Look, no offense." The receptionist tried again, softer now, "but the Titan Invitational isn't exactly beginner-friendly. Maybe observation would be more comfortable." Camilla's voice was calm, quiet, but it cut through the noise. "I didn't come to watch." She stepped forward, presenting her ID, invitation, and certification. Everything was in order, everything legal, and yet her presence, her quiet, unblinking presence, was a challenge more dangerous than any target. The range director arrived, a man in his 60s with white hair and a stiff spine. He scanned the paperwork, then her face. "You understand," he said carefully, "what kind of competition this is?" Camilla met his gaze. "I do," he sighed. "Then you're cleared for preliminary rounds. Weapon checks begin in 20 minutes. You'll be in lane 13. 13? A silent joke, maybe, a warning, or simply the one furthest from the others. As she walked away, men stepped aside as if she carried something contagious. She reached her lane without a word, placed the steel case on the counter, and opened it with deliberate ease. Inside lay a custom-fitted Glock 17 with visible wear. Clean, maintained, but no frills. No optics, no colored trim, no engraved brass. A working weapon, the kind carried into cities that no longer exist on maps. Camilla checked the chamber, inserted a fresh magazine, and adjusted her stance. Her back straight, elbows loose, grip firm. She didn't notice the stares now, or maybe she simply didn't care. To the side, Arnell watched with amusement curdling into something less defined. She wasn't loud, she wasn't dressed to impress, but there was something about the way she moved, something practiced, embedded into bone. Not learned in workshops or on YouTube, but on dusty ranges under unrelenting sun. He narrowed his eyes. "Gentlemen," he called out, "I think we've got ourselves a live one." He started walking toward her, his smile confident, his body language dripping with bravado. "Mind if I introduce myself?" he asked, loud enough for others to hear. "Arnell Baker. You might have seen my face on TV. Probably not in your neighborhood, though." She said nothing, simply returned her gaze to the paper target ahead. "You sure you're in the right place?" he continued. "This ain't a knitting circle." She didn't rise to the bait. Another man leaned over the lane divider. $10 says she doesn't even hit paper. A third smirked. 10 says she shoots the floor. More laughter. Still, Camilla didn't respond. Instead, she lifted the Glock, inhaled through her nose, and exhaled slowly. Her finger brushed the trigger. Her body became still as glass. The report was sharp, clean. The recoil barely moved her arms. The target edged back along the rail, rotating into view. A single hole punched dead center. No one spoke, not right away. Arnell's smile faded slightly. Beginner's luck. Camilla calmly ejected the magazine, checked the chamber, and reset. She was not there to prove anything to them. She had come for a different reason, one she hadn't spoken aloud even to herself. The echoes of her father's voice still lived in her memory, softer than the gunfire. Don't speak your value. Show it. Let them choke on your silence. In Lane 13, a shadow stood among titans, unbothered by the thunder around her. And though they couldn't name it yet, something had shifted in that room. A wind changing direction. They had laughed, but they weren't laughing now. That night, the Red Line Range stood silent beneath the Texas stars. The laughter that had once filled its corridors had faded, leaving behind a different kind of quiet, a stillness not born of peace, but of recalibration. The men, who had spent the day grinning, scoffing, and clapping each other on the back, now sat in subdued clusters, nursing drinks that tasted different than before. The woman in Lane 13 had unsettled something. It wasn't just the shot, it was the way she didn't flinch. The way she refused to acknowledge them at all. She had entered the club like a shadow, but she had left a ripple. Camilla Hope drove through the long stretch of country road with the windows down, the night air slicing through the silence like a scalpel. She didn't listen to music. The sounds she needed were already playing, in memory, not in stereo. Her father's voice, his laugh, the rhythmic sound of his footsteps beside hers in early morning training. As the wheels hummed against the asphalt, she reached into her jacket pocket and ran her fingers over the folded envelope. The paper was worn, the edges soft from time, but she hadn't opened it again. She didn't need to. When she reached the small rental house at the edge of a dry creek bed, she locked the door behind her, dropped her gear beside the worn couch, and walked into the room where the past still lived. A military footlocker sat beneath a shelf of aging books. On the wall hung a single photograph. General Elijah Hope in full-dress uniform, standing beside a younger Camilla at her basic training graduation, both of them straight-backed, eyes steady, smiles rare but real. She opened the footlocker slowly, the hinges creaking like reluctant memories. Inside lay the artifacts of a life spent in silence. Faded berets, worn fatigues, medals in velvet-lined boxes, a folded flag still wrapped in plastic. At the bottom, beneath the weight of service, she found the old leather-bound notebook. Her father's handwriting was precise, angular, and unapologetic. He had recorded everything. Target distances, weather conditions, breathing patterns, shooting drills, even observations about her performance. Her name appeared more and more as the pages progressed. Notes on her stance, her natural eye, her reflexes. On one page, written in a darker ink and underlined twice, he had written, "Camilla, 500 Waids, dead center, calm, under pressure, better than most." She sat on the edge of the bed, notebook open in her lap, and allowed herself to remember. It had started with a casual afternoon. She was still in high school, already taller than most girls her age, quiet to the point of invisibility. Her father had taken her to a remote training field, unrolling a mat on the dry grass. She had assumed it was one of his elaborate ways to lecture her about discipline or schoolwork, but instead he handed her a rifle and crouched beside her. "If I'm going to be away this much," he had said, "I need to know you can take care of yourself." It wasn't about hunting or competition. It wasn't even about teaching her his trade. It was about survival, protection, control in a world that offered little of it to women who looked like her. Camilla had taken to shooting with a quiet intensity. Unlike sports or academics, this didn't require words or social navigation. It required stillness, focus. Her hands didn't shake. Her breath fell into rhythm easily. Her father had watched her, not with surprise, but with a growing reverence. Over the years, while other teenagers went to parties or malls, Camilla spent weekends at the range. As her skills grew, so did the lessons. Her father stopped coaching like a parent and began training her like a soldier. They spoke in hand signals, communicated with eyes and timing. When he had nothing left to teach her, he began bringing her into exercises with former operatives, men who had worked with him overseas. They were skeptical at first, even dismissive, but after a few sessions they began to call her Little Shadow. Not mockingly, but with respect. When she enlisted in the military at 20, it had surprised no one in her family. She passed basic easily, excelled in advanced marksmanship, and was fast-tracked into special operations training. Her COs noted her discipline, her restraint, her eerie calm under stress. She wasn't the loudest or the strongest, but she was always the last one standing. She was deployed to conflict zones most Americans only heard about in passing. Arid villages, smoke-choked hillsides, cities reduced to whispers and rubble. But everything changed in Kandahar. The details were classified, the mission never confirmed, but the cost had carved itself into her body and mind. Her partner, a younger sniper named Hill, was gunned down due to a miscommunication in the chain of command. Camilla had been forced to hold the perimeter alone for 6 hours before evac. She had saved 2 civilians and survived a direct assault, but the grief stayed in her bones. When the brass issued a commendation, she declined it. When they asked her to return to duty, she quietly submitted her resignation. She did not want medals for death. She wanted silence. After her discharge, she had drifted. New Orleans, Baton Rouge, small towns and smaller jobs. She worked as a mechanic, repaired appliances, did freelance security work under aliases. She kept her weapons locked in a box, untouched. She hadn't fired a single round in nearly 2 years. Until the letter. It had arrived on her doorstep 3 months ago with no return address, just her name, written in her father's distinct hand. Inside was the invitation to the Red Line Range Invitational, his signature dated the week before he passed. Beneath the paperwork was a photo. Her, at age 18, mid-shot, eyes locked forward, rifle held with perfect control. On the back, a single line in faded ink. Prove them wrong, but do it your way. She hadn't cried, she hadn't spoken, she had simply begun training again. For 6 weeks she trained at an abandoned range on the edge of Lake Pontchartrain. She rebuilt calluses, timed her breath, practiced with unfamiliar weapons, knowing the red line wouldn't offer her comfort. She studied wind patterns, ran drills barefoot in the mud to steady her balance, and at night she read through her father's notes. She never spoke of it to anyone, and now, seated in the dim light of her rented home, with the echoes of the range still humming in her ears, Camilla closed the notebook and set it on the table. Her phone buzzed once, a text from an unknown number. Tomorrow's pairing schedule released. You've been matched with Arnell Baker in round 2. Heads up. No signature. She didn't reply. The message didn't surprise her. She had known from the moment Arnell had smirked at her that this wasn't over. Men like him didn't tolerate intrusion, especially not from someone who didn't look like them, didn't play by their rules, and didn't beg for acceptance. But Camilla wasn't there to be accepted. She wasn't there for the trophy or the title. She was there because a man she respected had asked her to reclaim a name that others had tried to bury, and she would do it the way he had taught her, not with speeches, not with defiance, but with the kind of silence that shattered myths. As she turned off the light and lay back on the worn mattress, the ceiling above her faded into shadow. The breath she took was deep, steady. Her body relaxed, but her mind remained sharp. Tomorrow would be louder, but she had lived through louder, and she would outlast it. The next morning arrived not with a roar, but with the quiet thrum of tension pressing against the thick, humid air that wrapped itself around the Red Line Range. The clouds that hung low over the Texas sky seemed to mirror the unease that had settled over the clubhouse. Word had spread like wildfire through the ranks of competitors and attendees about the woman, the shot, and the silence that had followed. Nobody could explain it fully, and that was what unsettled them the most. She hadn't yelled, she hadn't grandstanded, she hadn't even blinked. And yet, the echo of her bullseye lingered more sharply in their minds than any explosion of bravado from the day before. Camilla arrived alone and on time, stepping out of a dusty rental truck without ceremony. Her clothes were the same as yesterday: plain jeans, boots, and a dark button-down shirt tucked without flourish into a brown leather belt. No team colors, no sponsors. Her face remained unreadable, the deep composure of someone trained not only to endure pressure, but to be entirely indifferent to its presence. As she walked toward the check-in desk, conversations fell into hushed fragments. Eyes followed her, some curious, some amused, some hostile. Inside, the pairing chart had been posted on a large digital screen near the entrance. Camilla's name sat beside Arnell Baker's in bold red letters. Round 2, Lane 6. The match was scheduled for just before noon, but murmurs about it had already filled the lobby. The official title of the event was the Red Line Invitational Open Precision Tournament, but there was nothing open about its culture. The roster was nearly all male, nearly all white, and entirely wrapped in the unwritten understanding that women, especially women like her, were guests at best and intruders at worst. She stepped past a cluster of competitors clustered around a stainless steel coffee station. Their voices lowered as she approached. Wonder if she can even rack a bolt. Maybe she'll hit the target with her purse this time. She got lucky once, that's it. Camilla didn't look at them. She'd heard worse in combat zones, worse in classrooms, worse from men she once called superiors. She moved with the calm of someone whose validation came not from recognition but from preparation. Arnell waited near the range entrance, surrounded by 3 men in matching ballistic sunglasses and charcoal gray jackets, bearing the emblem of his personal security consultancy. His smirk grew as she approached, lazy and confident, like a lion regarding a gazelle. "Well, well," he said, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with theatrical amusement. "Thought you might be smart enough not to come back." Camilla met his gaze with the same stillness she had worn since arriving at the tournament. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied. His grin twitched. "You know, this next round's not paper targets, right? You'll be judged on time, accuracy, and adaptability. Moving targets, terrain variations, light changes. Think you can handle all that without fainting?" She let the silence settle between them until it became its own kind of answer. Behind them, a judge called for the next group to assemble. Camilla walked past Arnell without a word. Lane 6 waited ahead, a long stretch of dirt and gravel with staggered obstacles, mid-range steel plates, a series of partially obscured targets hidden behind mock cover structures, and a shifting light rig meant to simulate glare and low visibility. A light wind had begun to build, tugging at the flags positioned along the outer barriers of the field. At the ready table, she found her assigned rifle, a well-worn, generic semi-automatic with a factory scope and mismatched stock. No customization, no compensation. It was a test rifle, a baseline and not one designed for comfort. Arnell's weapon, by contrast, had been hand-tuned by a gunsmith from Georgia, with a carbon fiber chassis, precision trigger, and glare-reducing optics. Camilla studied both weapons without comment. One of the event officials leaned in toward her, clipboard in hand. "You've got 10 targets," he said. 3 moving, 3 partially obstructed, 4 in full light. You'll be graded on speed and grouping. 1 shot per target. Any questions?" "No," she said, adjusting the rifle strap across her shoulder. As the buzzer sounded, Camilla's body moved with a familiarity that transcended the environment. The first shot came in under 2 seconds, clean, dead center. The second followed, a moving plate that she led with surgical precision, compensating for wind. By the third, there were murmurs in the crowd again. Arnell was fast, aggressive, theatrical. He took each shot with practiced flair, pivoting with exaggerated gestures, drawing impressed whistles from a segment of the gallery. But he missed the 8th target entirely, his shot sailing half an inch above the metal plate's edge. A small detail, but not small enough. Camilla completed her set and stood. Her grouping was tighter, her timing more efficient. The only excess movement was the slight roll of her shoulders as she reset her breath. When the scores were posted, she had won the round by a narrow margin. There were no cheers, no handshake. Arnell simply turned his back. Camilla returned her weapon, nodded to the judge, and walked off the range. She didn't need celebration. She needed control. Later, in the clubhouse lounge, she sat alone at a corner table with a bottle of water and a small notepad. She wasn't taking notes. She was remembering. Adjustments, trajectories, where the wind caught her shoulder during the 5th shot, where the sun had refracted off a reflective surface behind the 7th, the kind of data most competitors ignored once a round was done. But she'd been trained to prepare for the next shot while recovering from the last. From across the room, she noticed an older man watching her. He was quiet, perhaps in his 60s, with a posture that hinted at military discipline. After a long moment, he approached her table and sat without asking permission. "I saw the last run," he said, "and I saw yesterday. You don't move like a civilian." Camilla said nothing. "I served under General Hope," he added after a pause. "Back when this place was first built. He used to say a real shooter doesn't need to be seen, just felt." Camilla studied his face. There was no arrogance in his tone, no expectation, just something approaching familiarity, recognition. She offered a single nod. "He was my father," she said. The man leaned back, hands folded. "Then it all makes sense." He left without giving his name. That evening, the sabotage began. It was subtle at first. Her assigned weapon for the next day's round had been changed without notice. The recoil spring was heavier, the optic misaligned by barely a degree. The cleaning cloth in her gear bag had been replaced with one soaked in solvent, enough to compromise her grip if unnoticed. Someone had been in her locker. But Camilla had expected this. Her father had warned her in 100 different ways about men who feared what they couldn't control. She cleaned the rifle herself. She recalibrated the scope using old-fashioned bore sighting and patience. She discarded the cloth and used her sleeve. What they didn't understand was that sabotage only worked on those who relied on comfort. That night, she didn't sleep much. Instead, she sat with the notebook again, her father's annotations circling her thoughts. Not instructions, reminders. "Discipline isn't a switch," he had written. "It's a state of being." She read those words until the wind outside calmed. Morning came with fire in the sky. Tomorrow the challenge would escalate. And she knew Arnell would not lose again quietly. He would not allow the headlines to read, "Anonymous Woman Outshoots Champion Without Retaliation." But Camilla wasn't afraid of retaliation. She had learned long ago that the worst men did not bark. They schemed, they whispered, they plotted in corners. But none of that mattered when your trigger pull was steady and your hands didn't shake. And hers never did. The sun had barely crested over the low hills flanking the Red Line Range when Camilla stepped onto the gravel path leading to the training field. The air held the dry scent of dust and spent powder. Her boots moved silently, her gait relaxed, but behind the measured pace was the alertness of a soldier scanning for signs unseen. Today's match would push the field of competitors into the semifinals, and the tension in the air had shifted from curious to combative. Whispers had evolved into strategy. Men who once jeered now watched her with narrowed eyes. Some kept their distance. Others didn't bother to hide their dislike. In the early light, everything appeared normal, but Camilla had learned long ago that danger never arrived shouting. It crept in slowly, unannounced, and often wore a smile. Inside the preparation bay, she approached her assigned lane and found the weapon she had been told she'd be using, an aged Sig Sauer M400, its matte black finish dulled and chipped along the handguard. She gave it a cursory glance, then picked it up and immediately felt the difference. The weight was uneven, subtly off-center. Her fingers brushed the trigger and registered increased resistance, at least 25% heavier than regulation. The optic had been nudged, barely, just enough to mislead a rushed shooter. Camilla turned to the supervising judge, a young man with close-cropped hair and an earpiece buzzing softly in his left ear. His clipboard was pressed against his chest like a shield. "This is the weapon you've logged?" she asked. He nodded, clearly uncomfortable. She made no accusation, just placed the rifle on the counter and began her inspection in silence. She field-stripped it in under a minute, confirmed the spring tension, cleaned the inside of the bolt carrier, and checked for tampering. The bolt had been polished, but unevenly. That meant it would stutter on rapid fire. Designed to cost her seconds, and if she wasn't careful, control of the weapon entirely. She didn't protest. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she reached into her small gear bag, withdrew a multi-tool, and began making corrections. Behind her, the other competitors glanced over with sideways curiosity. The range's ambient noise shifted with the weight of the moment. By the time she had realigned the optic and reassembled the rifle, a few observers had wandered closer, watching with a respect they hadn't previously offered. The round ahead was a mid-distance course, 150 to 300 yards, with randomized targets placed at variable elevations. Competitors would be required to fire from multiple stances, standing, kneeling, prone, while navigating over terrain meant to simulate urban obstacles. A steel tower flanked one end of the field, its steps rusted and uneven. Several walls had been built to obscure line of sight. Wind tunnels had been arranged in narrow alleys between the obstacles, affecting ballistics in unpredictable ways. Camilla stepped into the waiting zone behind her assigned start marker. Her breath was slow, controlled. Each footfall was deliberate as she moved forward under the judge's command. She stood next to a barrel painted red, the signal position. Across from her, Arnell adjusted his gloves and smiled with that same toothy confidence. His rifle gleamed under the morning sun, his gear pristine, his name stenciled on his tactical chest rig like a brand. "You sure you want to do this, sweetheart?" he asked, tilting his head. "Longer ranges, faster transitions, tougher wind. You ready for the deep end?" Camilla glanced at him once, expression unreadable. "I've swum deeper," she said. The judge raised his arm, held it high, and dropped it in a swift arc. The match began. Arnell bolted forward like a predator unleashed, bounding over the first obstacle and dropping to a crouch. His shots came in tight bursts, fast and showy, each one followed by a dramatic repositioning. Spectators clapped, impressed by his energy and aggression. Camilla did not sprint. She moved with precision, ducked when necessary but avoided wasted movement. At the first station, she adjusted for the wind sweeping left to right, took a breath, and fired once. The plate rang. At the second station, she lay prone on a concrete slab and hit two partially obscured targets without adjusting her body position, compensating only with wrist and breath control. Her third target was a narrow steel silhouette behind moving scaffolding, barely visible through a slit in the structure. Most competitors hit low or missed entirely. Camilla fired once, and the sharp metallic ping confirmed contact. Spectators who had been drawn to Arnell's bravado now began shifting toward her lane. Murmurs filled the crowd. Men in clean shirts and dark sunglasses took off their headgear and leaned forward, surprised by what they saw. One of the trainers leaned toward another and said, "She's not just good. She's reading the wind like it's in her blood." When the round ended, the scores were broadcast on the digital board above the observation deck. Camilla's name appeared first. Her time was slower by 6 seconds, but her accuracy and consistency had beaten Arnell's by a margin too wide to dismiss. Arnell's expression hardened. He offered no comment as he walked past her, but his eyes burned with something that bordered on fury. In the locker room later, Camilla found her personal gear bag had been moved. Its zippers were unfastened, and a thin layer of gun oil had been smeared across the inside of her eye protection lenses. Her gloves were damp. Her water bottle had been tampered with, its cap twisted loose, just enough to cause a spill if grabbed mid-match. She cleaned the glasses, replaced the gloves, and drank from her own backup bottle, one she'd brought in her jacket pocket. She said nothing to the range officials. She knew where this road led. A complaint would go nowhere. Denials would follow, blame would shift, and the sabotage would only evolve into something more subtle. Instead, she documented everything. Photos, notes. She memorized details. Locker placement, cameras, personnel in the vicinity. She knew how to make evidence into leverage if it came to that. Outside, the wind had picked up. The air shimmered with heat. The tournament was halfway over, and the final rounds would demand more than marksmanship. They would require endurance, composure, the kind of clarity that couldn't be sabotaged. Camilla sat on a metal bench beneath a narrow shade awning and opened her father's notebook. She traced a familiar passage. "They'll always try to shake you before the shot. Your strength is the silence after." Her phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. "Tomorrow's course just changed. 10 targets, variable weapons. Final stage is custom bolt action. Guess whose?" She stared at the message for a long time. Then she closed the notebook, stood, and walked back toward the range. She would stay until closing. She would walk the terrain. She would memorize the angles, the elevations, the light. Sabotage was an old tactic, but Camilla Hope was older still, in a way no calendar measured. Her father had trained her to expect resistance not because of her ability, but because of who she was. And that knowledge, planted like a seed, had grown into something unshakable. Tomorrow would bring escalation. And she would meet it as she always had, one breath at a time, one shot at a time, until the silence was louder than any of their names. The sky over the range was a sheet of pewter, stretched low and heavy with the promise of rain that would never fall. It was the kind of morning that pressed down on shoulders, made breaths feel thicker in the chest. The penultimate round of the tournament was set to begin in an hour, but the energy on the grounds had already shifted. Conversations that once flowed freely now trickled with unease. Competitors sharpened their focus in quiet corners, rifles laid across padded tables like surgical tools, their fingers moving with reverent attention. But not all movement came from discipline. There was something else in the air. Resentment, stoked by pride, bruised more than expected. Camilla arrived early again. She moved unnoticed at first, as she preferred, wearing the same neutral clothing, her gear bag slung across one shoulder like an afterthought. There was no team patch, no fanfare, no visible support. But her presence had begun to command attention in the same way lightning does before a storm, not by shouting, but by the inevitable stillness it left in its wake. She passed Arnell near the main staging corridor. He was flanked by two of his entourage, both whispering behind mirrored sunglasses. Arnell didn't speak, didn't smirk. He only watched her, and for the first time there was no trace of condescension in his stare. Only calculation. The ninth stage was to be held on a modified simulation field constructed specifically for the tournament's final stretch. The course mimicked the layout of an urban conflict zone. Broken vehicles, leaning walls, windows with partial visibility, sound distractions piped in through hidden speakers. Targets would be both static and dynamic, some painted to resemble hostiles, others designed to simulate civilians. The inclusion of no-shoot targets was new, and it forced competitors to not only be precise, but judicious. Mistakes here wouldn't just cost points. They would publicly define a shooter's discipline, or lack thereof. Camilla stepped into the ready zone with her assigned weapon, a mid-weight M110 with a detachable suppressor and a slightly misaligned cheek rest. She adjusted it silently. She had spent the evening before rereading her father's old formulas and diagrams, particularly those marked urban response. Notes on depth perception under stress, on compensating for echo, for light bouncing off glass. She had folded and unfolded those pages so many times they had grown soft and pliable, the ink slightly faded, and yet the memory remained sharp. She had committed it all to muscle. "Shooter 6 on deck," a voice called out through the overhead system. She nodded once, acknowledging, and made her way to the platform. The crowd around the arena had grown larger today, drawn by the rising tension and the promise of spectacle. Many had come to see her fall. Some had come to see if she could continue to rise. A handful, though few, simply watched with a quiet kind of hope that had nothing to do with sport. The buzzer sounded. Camilla stepped into the zone. She moved with the economy of someone who had lived through moments where time meant life. Each motion was compact, stripped of vanity. She scanned, identified, confirmed. First shot, right shoulder of a target half obscured behind a simulated wall. Hit. Second, lower torso of a moving silhouette dressed in gray. Clean. Third, no shoot. She paused, steadied her breath, didn't fire. A moment of silence, longer than most would risk, but she trusted her read. As the round unfolded, she worked the rifle like an extension of herself. The bolt cycled cleanly, her trigger pulls crisp, reset immediate. The world narrowed into a three-point system. Eyes, barrel, target. Nothing else existed. Not the audience, not the whispers, not the sabotage. She had long since pushed that aside. There was only the shot and the stillness before it. She completed the course 31 seconds faster than the average competitor and without a single mark against her judgment. The final shot, a moving target at 75 yards dressed in neutral colors, was dropped with a controlled shot that punched through the center mass. When she slung the rifle and stepped off the line, the field fell into a low murmur. Even the judges exchanged looks. Arnell followed her performance. His run was faster, brasher. He fired with precision, but also with showmanship, shooting from a crouch atop an overturned car, rolling across loose gravel to transition to prone. Theatrics that drew cheers from some corners of the crowd. But he clipped a no-shoot target near the end. Not enough to disqualify, but enough to draw attention to the difference in control. When the scores flashed on the leaderboard, Camilla's name once again edged above his. The margin was narrow, 2 points, but undeniable. She had won the 9th round. The reaction was fractured. Some clapped, others crossed their arms. A few turned away. Camilla didn't stay to absorb any of it. She returned her weapon, nodded to the nearest judge, and walked back toward the equipment area. She passed Rebecca Johnston, the senior match official, on the way. Rebecca had watched the round with narrowed eyes and an expression that had shifted over the course of the last 2 days from skeptical to intrigued. Now she offered something closer to admiration. "Impressive," she said quietly as Camilla passed. Camilla only gave her a small nod. She didn't seek approval, but the recognition, when given honestly, was acknowledged. Later that evening, as the last of the spectators drifted out and the sun bled into the horizon, Camilla remained. She stood at the edge of the field with a set of printouts Rebecca had slipped her under the table. Schematics for the final stage. It would be a long-range precision test, 10 rounds, all fired from a custom Macmillan TAC 338, one of only a few such rifles legally in civilian hands in the region. It was Arnell's specialty, a platform he had trained on for years, and one that had been specifically introduced into the competition only after she began rising through the brackets. Camilla read through the setup, distances ranging from 400 to 1,100 yards, crosswind zones, rotating targets, adjustable optics required, time constraints tight. She traced each detail with her eyes, then folded the schematic and slid it into her jacket. The next day would be the hardest challenge yet, not only because of the complexity of the course, but because of what it represented. A last attempt by the structure around Arnell to tilt the field in his favor. The final shot wouldn't just determine the winner of the Invitational, it would be a verdict on everything that had unfolded up to this point. A decision made not by committee, but by a bullet. She returned to her temporary quarters, unlocked the footlocker she had carried in her truck, and retrieved a box she hadn't touched since leaving New Orleans. Inside were notes her father had compiled during his own experiments with long-range ballistics. Handwritten calculations for wind drift at altitude, corrections for humidity variance, adjustment for thermal distortion over desert flats. Techniques born in war zones, not training facilities. She spread them across the table, reviewed each by lamplight. She didn't memorize them. She already had. The night passed in silence. At dawn, she returned to the range early, stepping into the spectator-free quiet with the ghost of her father's voice at her back. She stood at the edge of the final field, letting the wind brush her face, feeling the pull of distance, the stretch of steel between shooter and target. She had spent her life preparing for spaces like this, places where quiet determined fate, where chaos was best answered not with noise, but with focus. She was not nervous. not afraid. She was ready. And somewhere in the silence she knew her father was too. The day began with a deceptive calm, as if the world held its breath and refused to exhale. The sky above the Red Line Range was cloudless, painted in the sterile blue of late autumn, sharp and distant. No wind stirred the flag over the clubhouse, but those who had spent their lives reading more than just the weather could feel it. Tension, honed and ready, hiding beneath the surface like pressure behind glass. This was the final day, and the field had been pared down to 2. The scoreboard at the entrance bore only 2 names now, displayed in stark contrast against a black backdrop. Arnell Baker, Camilla Hope, the favorite and the anomaly, the heir and the outlier. The man who had long stood at the peak of the Red Line Range's hierarchy, and the woman who had arrived in silence, taken no part in its rituals, and yet stood poised to undo its unspoken order. The final challenge had been constructed overnight under the direction of Arnell's private technician. It occupied the furthest, most elevated section of the facility, where the terrain flattened into a long, unforgiving stretch of scrubland bordered by hills and dotted with steel-framed targets barely visible to the naked eye. The course was custom-built for one weapon, the Macmillan TIC 338. Precision-crafted, unforgiving, powerful. A platform designed for extreme distances and absolute control. It was the rifle Arnell had trained on, competed with, modified over years. It was also the rifle Camilla had never fired. The rules were simple. 10 targets, distances ranging from 600 to 1,200 yards, varying in size and speed. 5 minutes per competitor. Scoring was based on accuracy weighted against distance, with the final target, the furthest, partially concealed subject to wind, counting for 30% of the total score. The weapon would be provided by the organizers. No personal gear, no prior calibration. Everything riding on instinct, adaptability, and nerve. Camilla stood at the edge of the observation tent, studying the layout with quiet focus. She had arrived early, again, and requested no assistance. She hadn't spoken to anyone that morning, though Rebecca Johnston had approached her briefly, voice low, eyes scanning for listening ears. "There are inconsistencies," she had said. "Nothing I can flag officially, but the scope was offset before being reset. The stock's recoil pad was swapped out for a firmer material. It's minor, but it matters." Camilla had thanked her, that was all, she already knew. What they hadn't planned for was her preparation. The night before, she had trained at a private range 2 hours away, under the watch of someone who knew the TAC 338 not from catalogs or competitions, but from battlefields. Commander Wilson had greeted her with a nod and a clipboard, no introductions. She recognized him immediately, a former SEAL who had served under her father's command in Baghdad. They exchanged only the necessary words. Then he set up the rifle, adjusted for wind, and stepped aside. For 4 hours she practiced, not to perfect her aim, but to reacquaint herself with the language of recoil, the math of wind, the patience of breath. The TAC 338 was heavier than the rifles she favored, slower to cycle, less forgiving with poor positioning. But Camilla had never relied on forgiveness. She relied on familiarity. And Wilson's final words as he handed her a small notebook were all she needed. He said you had the calmest hands he'd ever seen. Don't let this place shake them. Now, standing behind the shooting position, she waited. The crowd gathered behind the safety barrier had grown significantly, swelled by media and military observers, veterans, sponsors, and civilians alike. Some came for the sport, some for the scandal. Most didn't know what they expected to see, only that they would witness something final. Arnell stepped up first. He wore his custom-fitted performance gear, shoulders squared, jaw set. His fans flanked the barrier, some holding signs, others clapping rhythmically. He acknowledged none of them. He was focused, but not calm. His movements were tight, deliberate, almost too precise. The announcer called the start, and Arnell dropped to prone. The first shot rang out crisp and fast. He hit the plate at 600 yards cleanly. The second, slightly smaller, adjusted for elevation, another hit. He cycled the bolt quickly, adjusted for wind on the third, nailed it again. The crowd began to cheer. But by the seventh target, something shifted. He clipped the edge of the plate, not enough to miss, but enough to force a recalibration. His next shot took longer. The ninth, a spinner at 900 yards, he struck dead center, drawing loud applause. Then came the 10th. The final target was set at 1,200 yards, partially obscured by a mock radio tower. It swayed faintly in the breeze that had picked up just enough to complicate things. Arnell steadied, adjusted, waited, and fired. The round hit right, but not center. It struck the plate's shoulder, good enough to count, but leaving his total score open to challenge. His run completed, he rose, nodded tightly, and stepped aside. Camilla approached next. She said nothing to the officials, took no breath of ritual, simply knelt beside the rifle, checked the bolt, and settled her body against the platform. The announcer began the count. "Shooter ready?" She nodded. The call came. "Engage." Camilla exhaled once, then fired. Her first shot struck center. The second came 3 seconds later. Clean. She was slower than Arnell by a margin, but her form was seamless. The rifle seemed a natural part of her body, as if her arms and the carbon frame had fused in quiet understanding. By the 6th target, whispers moved through the crowd. By the 8th, someone said her name aloud. By the 9th, perfectly struck in 2 breaths, Arnell had moved closer to the edge of the viewing area, hands on his hips, face expressionless. Then came the final shot. Camilla lay motionless behind the rifle. The world narrowed to scope and target. She adjusted for elevation, dialed the wind. A reflection flared in the tower's steel. A flicker of light meant to distract. She ignored it, took a breath, held, and fired. The ping of impact didn't come immediately, not at that distance, but when it did, it echoed like thunder. Direct hit, center plate. The crowd, silent a second too long, erupted, not in wild cheer, but in something deeper. Reverence, perhaps, a standing recognition that something had occurred which none of them could deny. The scoreboard lit up. Camilla Hope, first place. Arnell Baker, second. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. Rebecca stepped forward with the confirmation, targets in hand. Clean, verified, no margin of error. The judges nodded. Arnell walked toward Camilla, his face a mask no longer of contempt but of quiet disbelief. He extended his hand mechanically. She shook it once, firm and unbothered. "This isn't over," he said under his breath. Camilla held his gaze. "For today it is." Then she turned, walking off the platform, rifle unslung, her posture unchanged. She didn't smile, she didn't wave, but she didn't need to. Behind her, Rebecca faced the press. She revealed the footage. Security camera evidence of Arnell's technician entering the equipment room after hours. Tampering, adjustment, malicious intent. The room went still again. Arnell's expression collapsed. His team tried to intercept questions, but the damage was done. By nightfall, the video had circulated through news feeds and veteran forums. Headlines followed: praise for Camilla, investigations for Arnell. And in the quiet corner of a modest motel room, Camilla sat with a cup of tea and her father's notebook resting beside her. She hadn't returned the rifle. It sat nearby, cleaned and wrapped. A message blinked on her phone from Rebecca. They want you to speak. Public statement, TV spot, awards ceremony. Camilla stared at the screen for a long time, then closed the phone without replying. Outside, the wind picked up again. She watched it move through the trees. Then she whispered once, low and meant only for the silence. "This one was for you." And the silence whispered back. The sun rose over the Red Line Range with no ceremony, casting long golden streaks across the field where Camilla Hope had delivered her final shot just hours earlier. The air still held the echo of that bullet's impact, a sound that, though physically long gone, now lived in the memory of everyone who had witnessed it. That echo carried not only precision, but consequence. It had silenced a room. It had cracked through arrogance, and now, as headlines ran and footage replayed across countless platforms, it rippled far beyond the field where it had originated. Camilla awoke to a flood of notifications on her phone. Messages from journalists, military officials, veterans, even strangers from around the country. Many congratulated her. Some demanded interviews. A few challenged her legitimacy, unable to believe what they had seen. She ignored them all. The noise of validation was still noise, and she had never needed applause to know her value. In the hours that followed her victory, the fallout began in earnest. Arnell Baker, once the golden name of the Red Line Range, was under investigation not only by the tournament's governing board but by federal authorities. The wager he had initiated in public, coupled with the documented sabotage of competition equipment, constituted a violation of multiple statutes: fraud, tampering, gaming law infractions. What had begun as a bruised ego defending its pride had evolved into something with legal gravity. The range's internal committee, stacked with former generals, defense contractors, and corporate sponsors, called an emergency meeting. The footage Rebecca Johnston had released was undeniable. It showed Arnell's technician entering the secure weapons locker the evening before the final match, spending 13 minutes inside and exiting with gloves still on. No one could argue interpretation. It was proof, plain and dangerous. By mid-afternoon, Camilla received a formal letter from the Red Line Range's executive board. In it, they offered her not only an apology, but a permanent honorary membership, an engraved plaque in the Hall of Champions, and an open invitation to train or instruct at their facilities. Attached was a signed statement from the president of the board, acknowledging that their previous restrictions on open competition had contributed to a culture of exclusion. She read the letter once, then placed it in a drawer, not because it didn't matter, but because it wasn't why she came. Later that day, she met with Rebecca Johnston at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Rebecca looked different, less guarded, her professional detachment softened. "You could do anything now," she said, stirring her coffee. "Sponsors are reaching out. Defense magazines, TV shows, even a documentary crew from Canada." Camilla sat across from her, sipping water, her shoulders loose, her hands calm. "I didn't shoot for cameras," she said. "I know. That's why they're so desperate to have you." Camilla said nothing. She looked out the window, watching a breeze move through the trees. Rebecca hesitated, then placed a small envelope on the table. "The Veterans Support Foundation reached out," she said. "They saw the match, the footage, the whole story, One of their board members was your father's student. They want to meet with you." Camilla opened the envelope after Rebecca left. Inside was a card embossed with the Foundation's seal and a handwritten note from Colonel James Harrison, a retired Marine. "We've been developing a marksmanship rehabilitation initiative for veterans. We need instructors who understand not just shooting, but the silence that follows it. Your name came up more than once. We hope you'll consider joining us." The message was short, clear, sincere. Camilla folded it carefully, her thoughts quiet, not excited, not hesitant, simply in motion. 3 days later, she stood on the tarmac of a small training facility north of Dallas, facing 6 men and women in military fatigues, each at different stages of recovery. One had lost an arm and now trained with prosthetic adjustments. Another limped visibly from hip reconstruction. 2 had scars that ran deeper than skin, visible only in the way they flinched when the wind shifted suddenly, or in how they scanned the field like a battlefield. Camilla wore no insignia, no rank, just jeans, boots, and a gray shirt tucked into a leather belt. Her Glock was holstered but untouched. The Macmillan rifle sat in a padded case nearby, unopened. She stood with her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her voice low but steady. "My name is Camilla Hope," she said. "I'm not here to make you shooters. I'm here to help you find stillness. We're going to talk about breathing, balance, and what it means to fire when the world around you's too loud." There was no applause, no cameras, just nods and silence, the good kind. In the weeks that followed, her program grew. The Foundation granted her full authority to structure the curriculum. She called it the Ghost Line, named not for herself, but for the man who had taught her to see beyond the noise. Veterans from across the state applied. Some came looking for a way back to who they were. Others came not to find anything, but to forget. Camilla gave them the same things her father had given her: time, space, and the understanding that quiet was not weakness, but preparation. The shooting drills were only part of it. She built in walks at dawn, tea at dusk, journals, not scored targets. A rifle became a tool not for aggression, but for rhythm, breathing, connection. One day, a young man in his 20s, a former Army Ranger with shrapnel scars up both arms, stayed after class. He handed her a folded sheet of paper and said, "They told me I was ruined, that I'd never shoot again, but I hit all 10 today, because of you." She opened the note after he left. Inside was a sketch, rough but earnest, of a woman standing at the edge of a field, wind moving through her braids, rifle held loose at her side, target behind her already struck. The caption read, "She didn't come to win. She came to remember who she was." Months passed. At the Foundation's spring fundraiser, Camilla was invited to speak. She refused at first, then reconsidered. She stood on the makeshift stage beneath a tent filled with officers, donors, families, and fellow veterans. She wore the same field jacket she had worn the day she arrived at the Red Line Range, not out of symbolism, but because it still fit, and because it still reminded her that strength doesn't shout. "I came back to the world because I made a promise," she said, "not to prove anything, but because someone once believed in me when no one else did. My father was the kind of man who taught that precision mattered most in silence. He was stripped of his honor not because he failed, but because he refused to watch others be excluded. This program, this space, is in his name." She paused. "And in yours." She stepped down to applause, which she received with a quiet bow of her head. She didn't linger on stage. She preferred to return to her students, to the line, to the place where breath and trigger met. That same evening, the Foundation announced the creation of the Nathan Hope Scholarship for Excellence in Marksmanship Instruction. It would be awarded annually to veterans pursuing a career in training others, not in war, but in peace. The first recipient was that same young ranger who had returned to help teach the new recruits. He accepted with a hand that trembled, but eyes that no longer darted from sound. Camilla stood nearby, twisting her father's ring once around her finger. Not in nervousness, in memory. Later that night, she walked the range alone. No lights, no noise. Just the sky above her, wide and still, and the weight of knowing that the world, for all its shouting, had been moved by something far quieter. Not vengeance, not spectacle, but resolve. Not the loud ones, the steady ones. The ones who, when pushed into shadow, learned to breathe there, and waited until it was time to fire. She stood at the edge of the field, closed her eyes, and listened. The silence did not ask for more, because in it, everything had already been said. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for powerful stories just like this one, and share this with someone who needs to hear it.